All right, tonight we have a very special guest speaker, and we have a real privilege to actually learn firsthand from this man. Daryl Atkinson is a senior staff attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, where he focuses on drug policy and criminal justice reform issues. Now, Daryl was recognized in 2014 as a reentry and employment champion of change by none other than the White House. Accolades don't get much higher than that. And just this past July, he was recognized as the first ever Second Chance Fellow and will serve as an advisor to the Department of Justice and the administration. So, Daryl, we understand you've traveled far and wide to be with us here tonight. We thank you for that. He came from North Carolina. Hope you enjoy the Northwest weather. It has been behaving. It always does for guests, but we're glad you helped bring it along as well. But he's here to really share his story about how he overcame his own involvement in the criminal justice system and to discuss the real-life impacts of having a criminal record. We're just going to talk plainly here because that's how you get things done. Just hearing from the heart of those who know exactly what we're trying to do in this community. So at this time, without further ado, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Daryl Atkinson.
So I'm going to pull out this phone to help me stay on time. They gave me a certain amount of time, and I don't want to abuse the privilege, but I do consider it an honor and thank all of the folks affiliated with Pioneer for inviting me to be with you all this evening. I toured the facility and learned a lot about this amazing organization and heard about the history, and I think there's a significant learning in even the founding of the organization. And one of the things that I hope folks take away is the genius of people who've been directly impacted by systems and how they can come up with solutions to the issues that affect them and people like them. And that's not something that I take lightly. And I hope I can do honor to that. I want to compliment the work of Pioneer. I mean, as someone who has his finger on the pulse of this work nationally, this is my first time hearing about the organization. And I'm like, why is this one of the best kept secrets in the country? This should really be highlighted as a national model. I mean, the social entrepreneurship, the wraparound services with regards to housing, employment, substance abuse treatment is really at the cutting edge of what folks need once they've been in contact with the system. If I could title my talk, I would title it Reflections from a Canary in the Mine. And what I mean by that is, in South Africa, they would send canaries into the mines to test the environment, to see if it was safe to go down there. If the canary didn't come back, you might not want to go down there. There's some noxious gases, some unhealthy, attributes to that particular environment. And I like to think of myself as one of those canaries. But before we start talking about the environment, what are some of the characteristics of the mine? It's dark, it's unpleasant, but if you put a little elbow grease down there, you can really mine some valuable jewels. And I want you to keep that as a placeholder as I continue with my story. As I said, I like to think of myself as one of those canaries in the mines. And one of the things that I want to share with you tonight is just kind of broad landscape of the environment. The environment of our prisons, the environment of our current state of reentry, and really what I think is telling an environment of our society. What does it tell about us today? That we got 2.2 million people in a cage. And I use those descriptors very intentionally because anybody who's ever been in a cage knows that that 8 by 11 isn't a very accommodating space. We got 65 million people, between 65 and 71 million people with a criminal record. We have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Which begs the question, either we're the most morally depraved nation on the planet, or we're doing something really, really different than other contemporary democracies. The demographic breakdown of those folks is not representative of the demographics of our general population. 1 in 106 white males are currently incarcerated, 1 in 36 Latino males, 1 in 15 black males, 1 in 9 black males between the ages of 20 and 34. 60% of our total corrections population is either black or Latino. And what does that say about us as a society? What does that say about those communities and their ability to generate wealth, their ability to have vibrant, whole, healthy communities? So some of these indicators of our external environment don't paint a very healthy picture. And I use the word indicators intentionally because I know we have a multidisciplinary group, and I kind of let the data and the outcomes kind of tell the story themselves. So folks who are economists, for example, we have a number of economic indicators to tell us the health of our particular system. We look at NASDAQ, we look at GDP, we look at unemployment rates, and that gives us a picture of how well our economy is performing. When we look at our criminal justice system, we should let those outcomes also tell us a picture of how well that system is performing. In 1996, I pled guilty to a first-time nonviolent drug crime. I was sentenced to 10 years in prison. I served a mandatory 40 months on that 10-year sentence. I went into prison with a high school diploma. I came out with a high school diploma. The state of Alabama, where I did my time, wasn't nearly as progressive as many other states in offering post-secondary education opportunities. I couldn't even take correspondence courses if I was willing to pay for them. Fortunate enough for me, I returned home to a loving family that could provide me food, clothing, and shelter. I had those basic Maslowian needs met, right? And I could aspire towards higher things. Not everyone is going to return to that kind of family. Not everyone is going to return to that kind of community. So how do we create secondary support systems where more folks can be successful? We do that with organizations like Triangle Community. We do that with public-private partnerships that provide opportunities for people with records. But I think my story really highlights some of the systemic deficiencies that our current system is operating under. When I think of reentry, we have to get ahead of this issue. Wayne Gretzky, and I like telling stories, y'all. Y'all got to forgive me. I'm a recovering trial lawyer, and that's our job, is to tell stories. They asked Wayne Gretzky, how did you score all of those goals, Wayne? Is it because you knew where the puck was? He said, no, I knew where the puck was going to be. We have to be able to get ahead of this problem at some point. So thinking about prisoner reentry at the moment of release, or 6 months prior to release, or even at intake, I would say it's too late to be thinking about the problem. At various points in the system, we have an opportunity to mitigate harm, to address a sanction, to address harm that's been done in the community, but also set that person up so they could be successful. Public defenders, prosecutors, judges, legislators, correction staff, all play a part in that picture. And my story illustrates some of those systemic failures. Mandatory minimum sentences. The judge had absolutely no discretion to downwardly depart. I had no choice but to go to prison. Did I have to go to prison? I don't think so. Did I do something wrong? Absolutely. Could have been dealt with in another way, most definitely. And so we have to think about changing and turning down the faucet, right? Stopping the flow of people who come in contact with the criminal justice system in the first place. We can come up with other more creative ways to deal with so-called deviant behavior in our communities. Ineffective assistance of counsel. My paid lawyer, because I didn't have a public defender, the lawyer who I paid $15,000 as a retainer did not file one pretrial motion, did not do any fact investigation. I didn't know this until I got behind the wall and started investigating my case. but did none of the basic legal requirements of competency. And poor people are very much subjected to that kind of representation on a day-in, day-out basis. And it results in many folks going to prison and coming in contact with the criminal justice system with a conviction unnecessarily. So if we're really serious about good reentry practices, we should want to make sure that the folks who represent poor people, who 80% of the folks who come in contact with the system are declared indigent and are in need of a public defender, we need to make sure that they have competent counsel. Lack of alternatives to incarceration. There was no diversion, there was no law enforcement assistant diversion like you all have in Seattle and in Alabama. It was only incarceration. And an old adage, when the only toolbox that you have in your toolkit is a hammer, everything starts looking like nails. We have to have other tools to be able to deal with harm that happens in our community. So we have a significant portion of people who are currently behind the wall who have documented mental health issues. The biggest and I normally have candy, and when I'm doing presentations, when folks give the right answer, I toss it out, so forgive me, I don't have candy tonight. What is the biggest mental health provider on any given day in the country? Corrections? More specific, which Department of Corrections? LA County, Cook County, Rikers Island on any given day. Those are our biggest mental health providers on any given day in this country. So we can find another way to deal with people who might be acting out because they're having a mental health episode rather than incarcerate them. Now I want to talk a little bit about the state of reentry practice currently going on in the country. We have a federal system, and then we have 50 different state systems, right? And there's no coordinated reentry response. In my situation, I went in, I started off at a medium security institution, worked my way down to a minimum security institution, got into a little bit of trouble, ended up finishing my time at a maximum security institution. The institution that I was released from, 60% of the population had life without parole. You would ask the men at that institution how much time they had, they would say all of it, because they never were going home. And it was there that I met a gentleman who actually planted the seed on what I was going to end up doing in the future, who introduced me to the law. He was what some folks refer to as a jailhouse lawyer. And his name was James McConico. And James was really good at getting men out of prison who had their probation or their parole had been wrongfully violated. They were technically violated and they shouldn't have been. And so a lot of people wanted James to work on their cases. And James used his legal skills as an opportunity to really transform lives. And I can remember this one particular episode. I'm in his cell. We're having a conversation. Gang-involved individual comes in his name was C Monster, black as coal, from Selma, Alabama. He had a 12-pack, and I never saw him do a sit-up, right? He was just cut like that. And he comes in with a pillowcase filled with coffee and cigarettes, and he wants James to work on his case. And James said, "I don't want your jail money." And he was like, "Well, I'll get my folks to send your folks a money order, and I can get you some free world money." And he was like, "I don't want your money." And then C Monster said, "Well, what do you want?" And James knew he had him at that moment. He said, "I want you to learn the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Alabama Rules of Civil Procedure, the Alabama Rules of Evidence, the Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure, and I want you to go do political education with Brother Mafundi, and after you do some of that, come back and I'll work on your case. And also, I want you to drop your colors. No more gang banging in the cell block. No more beating up your fellow brothers behind the wall over petty beefs." And many of the men would go and find someone else to work on their case, but many of them stuck. And on any given day, in that institution, when yard call, when we could go out and play, if you will, instead of going to lift weights or going to play basketball, you would see 40 or 50 men walk into the law library. And James essentially created a firm behind the wall. And it was there that I saw the transformative power of direct services and also of how legal skills could be used to change lives. And I wanted to be able to do that on the outside. So my reentry story also tells, the corrections part of my reentry story also highlights some other systemic failures. And when you think of these systemic failures, just flip the coin, because there's a policy prescription to the bad outcomes that I'm talking about. Lack of meaningful educational opportunities. See, I went into prison at the height of the war on drugs, where we wanted to just punish folks to no end, and ended Pell Grant opportunities for people inside where they could pursue post-secondary education. And that happened under the Clinton regime. And even though Pell Grant expenditures for correctional education represented 1% of total Pell Grant expenditures, and all of the data showed that improving someone's human capital fundamentally changed their life, let's take that from them and punish them some more. One thing that I really want you to leave with, the punishment is the taking of your liberty. It's not draconian conditions once you've had your liberty taken. The punishment is the cage. So no meaningful educational or vocational opportunities. Policies and practices that made it difficult to maintain family connections. Making a phone call, $20, $30. Visits where my folks were treated as second-class citizens. Really disincentivized family from maintaining that connection. When once again, all of the evidence shows that strong familial connections lead to better outcomes, makes people want to be more compliant, and actually incentivizes the safety within institutions, right? So this is something that should really be messaged to correction staff. You want a better custody and control of your institution? Make sure folks have an opportunity to see and talk to their family members, because that incentivizes good behavior. Overuse of solitary confinement. I got into a fight over a coffee cup that my mother had sent me in my Christmas package. And you may think, wow, Daryl, that is something really petty to get into a fight about. And I agree. But you got to understand the subculture and the rules of the game where I was operating, right? If I allowed them to take that cup, they would have never stopped taking. They would have come back again and again and again. So the rules of that subculture required me to stand my ground. And the inmate to guard ratio was about 1 to 75. So there's no going and running telling correction staff, oh, someone's picking on me, right? You kind of have to fight your own battles, if you will. And because of that fight, I was sent to solitary confinement. I was back there for about 4 months. But one of the things, though, that and you all got to forgive me, I'm a deacon in my church, so if I start preaching, just bear with me. There's a scripture in the Bible that says what the adversary meant for bad, God will mean for your good. And it was there that I had a moment of reflection to look at that 8x11 lockdown, 23 hours of the day, fed at 4 a.m. and 4 p.m., only allowed to shower every other day, that I said, enough of this. My best thinking has landed me to this spot, and I want to do something different. That is not an endorsement of solitary confinement. That's just one of the epiphanies that I had at that particular moment. Also, the unnecessary elevation of custody status because of breaking of rules. Anyone who's ever been in an institution knows that they have a rule book this thick. Everything from not talking during the count to not fraternizing with folks who might be considered in a gang, to any number of rules. And those rules can result in you being sent to institutions that you really might not belong at. At the beginning of my story, I think I told you all I had a 10-year sentence. I never should have been at a maximum security institution. I never should have been sent there. The state was putting me in a situation where either I was going to have to hurt someone really bad for my survival, or someone was going to hurt me. And that's a decision that no human being should have to live with, should have to make on a day-to-day basis. On November the 4th, 1999, I was released. This November the 4th will mark 16 years since that day. And this is where my story gets a little bit atypical. My mom and my stepfather, they came and picked me up. They rented a Lincoln Town car to come pick me up. Now, both of them had operating vehicles, right? And I queried them and asked them, why did you rent that town car to come pick me up? And they said, we wanted you to leave that place in class. We wanted you to know that this was the start of a new beginning. And once again, my biblical reference is very much like the prodigal son, right? So when the prodigal son came home, they slaughtered the fatted calf and they gave him a robe of colors. You know, my fatted calf was Waffle House. But, you know, it was that was the first meal I ate, and it did not agree with me at all. It went straight through me. I mean, man, I know that's TMI, right? And they took me shopping, and, you know, that was my robe of colors. Imagine if we as a society treated our folks like that. Imagine if we looked at them the same way that my family looked at me. And I would submit that we should. These are our community members. These are folks who we went to church with, who we played rec basketball with, who we have some degree of relationship with. And we should welcome them back and let them know that we expect great things out of you. And thinking about that, I really want you to think about the language that you use when you refer to people. So I don't consider myself an ex-offender or ex-convict or ex-felon. Those are pejorative labels in my mind, negative labels that seek to define me by some of my worst choices. I'm more than that. I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a litigator, I'm a deacon in my church. But most importantly, I'm a child of a Most High God. So I refuse to be defined by a single moment in time. And you know what? That Representative Pettigrew, that doesn't require legislation, right? We don't have to go and pass anything or ask for an appropriations to modify the language that we use. So what should we call folks, Daryl? I'm so glad you asked. How about people? People with records. People who've been to prison and jail. But the operative word is people, because it affirms their humanity. And this in a hug-a-thug moment, right? Language frames the debate. And I use history as my teacher. Whenever we wanted to do something really bad to a group of folks in this country, the first thing we did was debase them with the language that we used to refer to them with. And that makes it much easier to trample over their rights, over their humanity. So I would encourage you all to modify the language that you use when you refer to people. They're just people. What does this mean for our society if we don't get this right, y'all? We are at a critical moment. We're going to have 700,000 people per year released every year. And that's just for the next 15 years. That's just state and federal correctional facilities. That's not even talking about the 10 to 12 million folks who cycle in and out of jails. If we don't get this right, we're talking about a public safety nightmare, because nationally 2 out of 3 folks fail and end up going back to the system. Every time someone's failed, that's new victimization. When we think about recidivism, recidivism is a public safety nightmare. And some of the best data tells us the most successful interventions are improving human capital in education, getting someone a job. It ain't rocket science, right? If someone has a way a viable legal way to make a living, they aren't climbing through your window. You know what I mean? So if we're really serious about public safety, we'll be concerned about getting people back to work who have records. This is also an economic efficiency issue. We spend about $80 billion per year just on the corrections component. I'm not even talking about law enforcement and the adjudicative function. You're roughly over $100 billion. We can't afford this anymore. We got to do something different. Our addiction to incarceration as the social service of first response, we can't afford it. So we have to make some different choices. In addition, we're missing out on all of that human capital. One economic think tank estimated that we're losing between $50 and $65 billion in GDP contributions from people with records who can't contribute to the economy because they're shut out of the work environment. Lastly, this is a moral issue. What does it say about our country to have so many of our folks thrown to the trash heap of life, never having a second chance? America is the land of second chances. People, we are an immigrant story. People have come from all over the world to start anew. But we aren't allowing second chances to people with records in our own country. And it's hurting the economic vitality of this country. We're undergoing some huge demographic shifts. The baby boomer generation, some of you who I see because of some of the wisdom evidenced by the gray hair, is aging out of the workforce. I talked to 2 or 3 folks who were talking about, I've retired. And they made significant contributions to our economic vitality. They're aging out of the workforce. While at the same time, our country is getting browner. We're going to be a majority-minority country by 2040, by some demographers' estimates. If Black and Latinos who are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, if they don't have access to opportunity, how are they going to build the human capital to replace that workforce? And that affects all of our 401ks. That affects GDP, which we use to pay for national defense, which we use to pay for infrastructure, which we use to pay for all of the freedoms and basic necessities of life that we take for granted, which really set us apart as a nation. Our economic vitality and identity as a nation is at risk if we don't solve this problem. So join me collectively in celebrating and supporting the pioneers of the world, in supporting progressive reentry policies and practices that our policymakers are trying to enact, by making opportunity available to all of our citizens. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the gracious welcome that I've received.